All right, we would away. Please be seated. We as well. Good afternoon. Welcome back, Madam Prosecutor. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Your Honor. I will start with the references you requested, and please accept my apologies for skipping over them previously. So, in relation to my previous submissions, for the destruction of the Boeing Mosque, please refer to CAR OTP 2127 6626 at 6627. For the destruction of Muslim property slide, CAR OTP to 0750670. For the destruction of a Muslim-owned house, CAR OTP to 0140751. For Muslim refugees at the Bangui airport imagery, CAR OTP 2107-1185. For images related to the PK5 enclave and the January convoy, CAR OTP to 0730258 and 0338. Related to the 1st April convoy, the images, CAR OTP to 061 4281, 4284, 4285, and 4287. In relation to the living conditions in PK5, CAR OTP to 0730269. The image related to the count of murder related to Bosangoa, CAR OTP to 0882207. Imagery related to the destruction in Bosangoa, CAR OTP to 0790671. In relation to the destruction of the mosque in Bosangoa, please refer to CAR OTP to 0882204. Then, in relation to the enclave in Bosangoa, the imageries that you saw are at CAR OTP to 127-6626 at 6629. Related to the conditions in the Bosangoa enclave, the video is at CAR OTP to 0790677. And then the video with the quote, "They do the same to us," is at CAR OTP to 0665308. The video with the quote, "We are going to kill the little children too," is at CAR OTP to 0653188. And the last video before the break referencing the quote, "We are going to make a massacre," is at CAR OTP to 0655468.
Thank you very much.
Your Honors, before the break, we had begun speaking about the contributions of Mr. Mokom, and I had left off at discussing his contributions in terms of weapons and ammunitions to the Antibalaka. In order to address the evidence in relation to this contribution, I would like to request a short private session because the insider witnesses I will reference have to stay protected.
Yeah, the request is granted. Mr. Court Officer, please.
We're back in open session, Mr. President.
Thank you, sir. Kindly continue.
In addition to arranging such material supplies, Mr. Mokom kept track of the enlistment of fighters. An insider witness from the Gobera group, who helped compile these lists, explained how it worked from the car side. And this I can reference in open session because it was also referenced openly in Yakatoman and Gaisona. For the record, the reference here is the witness's statement at car OTP 2031-0248 at paragraphs 36 and 38, and his trial testimony at car OTP 0000950 at pages 14 to 15 and 18 to 20. According to this witness, when a new fighter joined the group, their name would be recorded on a registry the group had. Later, an anti-Balaka leader, like Dadan or Kema, would communicate the names of new fighters by phone to Mr. Mokom. Adjustments to the lists would also be communicated after attacks to keep track of which men had been lost and which were still alive. The witness says that these lists were sent to Mr. Mokom. A Zongo-based witness confirms that Mr. Mokom recorded and maintained these types of lists of fighters, and on his computer. For the record, the reference is car OTP 2100-569 at 0282, paragraph 72. Using his knowledge of the situation in the field, Mr. Mokom helped advise also on troop movements and helped plan and direct early attacks in the provinces between September and early December 2013. This is according to witnesses on the ground in Kar and witnesses based in Zongo alongside Mr. Mokom. For the record, the references include Kar OTP 2031-0241 at 0247, paragraph 33, and Kar OTP 2100-569 at 2574, paragraphs 26 to 31. Mr. Mokom also contributed to the charged attacks and resulting crimes, therefore, by encouraging his associates who were with him in Zongo to fight with the anti-Balaka. The prosecution's list of witnesses include two examples of such associates. Both of these witnesses report having been encouraged or directed by Mr. Mokom to cross the river from Zongo into Kar to join the anti-Balaka. And both of these prosecution witnesses ultimately took part in the charged attack on Bangui. The first of these two witnesses is P0446. He describes attending a meeting that Mr. Mokom held in Zongo shortly before the Bangui attack, where many other elements attended as well. In that meeting, Mr. Mokom called upon his comrades to join the fight in Bangui. The witness was one of many men who answered that call. He and others crossed over to Bangui shortly thereafter and fought in the charged attack. The reference here is Kar OTP 2059-1626 at 1646. The witness's account that Mr. Mokom sent fighters from Zongo to Bangui shortly before the charged attack is supported by Mr. Mokom's own Facebook communications from the period where Mr. Mokom refers to his men having crossed over to Bangui. In a conversation on 2nd December 2013 with another member of Bozizi's inner circle, Mr. Mokom tells this man, and I quote in French, "Mes hommes d'ici ont
My men here have already crossed over to Bangui.
Tout se passe bien.
Everything is going on well. We are together.
For the record, the reference is CAR OTP to 066 3003 at 3078. Another witness says Mr. Mokom had given him a task when he left Zongo, and that was to fight the Seleka to help lead the rebellion. The witness performed this task, including by fighting in attacks in the provinces and ultimately taking part in the charged 5 December attack on Bangui. The reference here is CAR OTP to 1110336. Now, Your Honors, Mr. Mokom was not physically present during either the Bossangoa or the Bangui attacks. And for sure, Mr. Mokom was also not the only person involved in planning, overseeing, or otherwise being involved in these two offensives. Nevertheless, the evidence shows that Mr. Mokom's actions encouraged the fighters to come together and therefore helped carry out these attacks. Broadly speaking, Mr. Mokom's efforts to liaise between different anti-Balaka groups and members served to help unify these groups and focus their aims on a larger goal beyond defending their own villages. According to P0889, it was due to Mr. Mokom that people like Angelo and other anti-Balaka leaders ended up going to Bangui to fight the Seleka in the capital. This witness describes how Mr. Mokom achieved this by encouraging the different village self-defense groups to come together to help take back their villages, and then eventually to come together and to free Bangui. The reference here is CAR OTP 0000942 at pages 16 to 17. To illustrate this with an example, Your Honors, I would like to go again into a brief private session.
Yeah, the request is granted, Mr. Court Officer.
We're back in open session, Mr. President.
Many thanks. Kindly continue.
In relation to the Bangui attack, insiders give detailed first-hand accounts of Mr. Mokom's actions. They say that Mr. Mokom helped prepare the strategy for the attack, liaised continuously by phone with key personnel in Bangui in the days before the attack. Again, he was not the only one doing this, but these insiders support that he had a role to play. The references here are CAR OTP 2100 to 569 at 0576, paragraph 37. The accounts of these insiders are supported by the insider accounts of other anti-Balaka who were across the river and in Bangui at the time of the attack. These include P0446, who states that Mr. Mokom, while based in Zongo, remained as the overall coordinator of the attack, coordinating by phone. For the record, the reference is CAR OTP 2059-1672 at 1693. As an aside note, Your Honors, Zongo is so close to Bangui, mere 2 kilometers away, that phone calls from Zongo connect to Bangui cell sites. Telecommunications support that Mr. Mokom was actively engaged in relation to the 5 December attack. These records show Mr. Mokom communicating with known leaders of the attack, including the day before the attack and during the attack itself. Mr. Mokom was in particularly frequent contact with Charles Ngremangu and Yvonne Konate. As noted previously, both of them played an important role in this attack. Ngremangu as one of the leaders of the group that attacked the Boeing area, and Konate as the leader of the group that targeted Camp Kasai. On 5th December 2013, Mr. Mokom's first contact with Konate started very early at 43 minutes after midnight. Mokom's last call of the day at 22 hours 16 was also to Konate. For the record, I'm referring you here to the call sequence table at CAR OTP 00001189 at rows 154 and 538. Similarly, Mr. Mokom's first contact with Ngremangu started in the early morning of the day of the attack. They first spoke at 5 hours 32 and continued in frequent contact throughout the day, with the last contact at 16 hours 40. I'm referring again to the same call sequence table at rows 169 and 500. The records also show Mr. Mokom communicating on the day of the attack with fighters that he had sent from his Zongo group, namely Lieutenant Bruno Semdira and Lieutenant Abdel Danamganai. I refer here to rows 381 to 382 and rows 442 to 445 of the same call sequence table. I will now turn to Mr. Mokom's contributions in the period after the attack, when he had relocated to Bangui. According to multiple insiders, Mr. Mokom continued to coordinate the anti-Balaka first from his base in Zongo, and then after relocating to Bangui, from Bangui itself. In a video referenced at CAR OTP 2095 to 903, filmed on 10th December, Yaguzu is filmed speaking about still being in contact with Commander Mokom. He refers to him as l'unique commandant Mokom, regarding decisions on strategy. The evidence shows that Mokom relocated to Bangui around 6 February 2014. Mr. Mokom was then officially designated as the Anti-Balaka National Coordinator of Operations at the latest on 14th February 2014, when it was announced. Your Honors, please recall what the situation for Muslims was like in Bangui at this time. One insider witness states that Mokom then said the following at a meeting with Comzones right after he came back to Bangui. And I quote, "You know how we worked on our way to Bangui. The objective is to bring back Bazizi to Bangui. I ask all Comzones to give me an overview about their men, their weapons, and the men who died. We are facing a big fight. We will prepare this fight for our reward tomorrow. We came to liberate the population and to chase out the Seleka. When the Seleka have left, the power will be ours." This citation is at CAR OTP 2090-0561 at 0579, paragraph 138. After this joint event, the same insider describes how Mr. Mokom then toured the different bases in Bangui. And in this time, when he was proximate to the crimes of the Anti-Balaka in Bangui, he strove to make them more efficient, more structured. He was involved in a number of activities as operations coordinator. These included setting up military police, billeting of elements, measures to enlist elements in DDR, and to assist in getting anti-Balaka detainees released. Mr. Mokom would also check with Comzones on the situation in their neighborhoods. He would verify information on attacks and respond by talking to people also by phone in this period. According to P2232, Mr. Mokom would approve military activities of the Comzones together with Engaisona in this time. And I refer you to CAR OTP 2100-2569 at 2582, paragraph 54, 66 to 71, 84, and 86 to 87. P1719 also confirms that from the province where he was after the attacks, the witness I mean, he would usually speak with Mr. Mokom and speak with him on anti-Balaka activities because he had this role. I refer you to CAR OTP to 0620039 at 0054, paragraph 92. Another witness states that Mr. Mokom would ask Yaguzu to gather the Comzones at Engaisona's house. The reference is CAR OTP to 072-1739 at 1753 to 1757. The descriptions of Mr. Mokom's support to the anti-Balaka as part of the national coordination in this period are represented in his communications to key members of the national coordination, which your honors can find in Annex C2 to the DCC. And I specifically refer to paragraphs 19 to 20, 28 to 29 of this annex. His support to the organization through the national coordination is also reflected in documents. For example, on your screens now is a declaration issued by the Anti-Balaka on 14th February 2014 and provided by a prosecution witness. This declaration shows the military structure of the Anti-Balaka and Mr. Mokom's position in this structure as National Operations Coordinator. The reference is at CAR OTP 20250380 at 0385. Another example is this Anti-Balaka communique of 16th March provided by a prosecution witness. Here we see Mr. Mokom's signature. He is signing in his capacity as National Operations Coordinator. The reference is CAR OTP 20350061. Now, Mr. Mokom's contributions in this period were not reduced to supporting the anti-Balaka and Bangui. He also contributed to the ongoing activities of the anti-Balaka, which resulted in ongoing crimes against Muslims in Bossangoa after 5 December. Mokom had a long-standing relationship with the anti-Balaka Comzone, Kema, starting from the Zongo period onward. As P0446 explains, Mr. Mokom was the operations coordinator, and as such, he was in continual contact with all the anti-Balaka groups and the youth which had organized themselves in self-defense groups in the provinces. I refer you to CAR OTP to 059-1626 at 1642 and the same document at 1645. Mr. Mokom remained in contact with Kema after Mokom had returned to Bangui. Kema would come to Bangui for meetings while he was still in charge of Bossangoa and overseeing the anti-Balaka activities in Bossangoa at the time. Thus, after the 5 December attacks, Mr. Mokom continued to support the anti-Balaka subgroups through his role in the national coordination, working towards cementing its power while the anti-Balaka in Bangui, as well as in Bossangoa, displaced, deported, forcibly transferred Muslim civilians, deprived them of their liberty in the enclaves, and destroyed their houses and religious sites. Now, let me be clear. The prosecution is not suggesting that it is a crime under the statute simply to support the military activities of an armed group. But such support may lead to criminal responsibility if it contributes to the commission of crimes under the statute, and if the contributor has the required intention or awareness concerning those crimes. And this was the case for Mr. Mokom, who knowingly and intentionally contributed to the activities of the anti-Balaka and therefore to the crimes. Let me turn to this in detail now. There are substantial grounds to believe that Mr. Mokom had the requisite intent and knowledge for the charged crimes under the modes of liability charged. Specifically, Mr. Mokom had the requisite knowledge because he was aware, since it was common knowledge, that many anti-Balaka fighters would not distinguish between Seleka fighters and Muslim civilians. He was aware, since it was common knowledge, that anti-Balaka attacks in the provinces routinely resulted in civilian casualties and destruction of property. He was therefore aware, when he made his contributions, that the charged crimes would occur in the ordinary course of events. Given his role and the nature of his activities, Mr. Mokom knew the consequences of supporting the anti-Balaka. Once properly mobilized and given the chance to attack the Seleka in Bangui and Bossangoa, Mr. Mokom knew that the anti-Balaka would also target the Muslim civilian population alongside the Seleka and commit the charged crimes. He could not have failed to know this, given all circumstances, including the recent history, the calls for revenge, the violent rhetoric, and other evidence before you. Nevertheless, Mr. Mokom made the choice to persist in his contributions to the activities of the anti-Balaka throughout the charged period. He made this choice even after the anti-Balaka attacks in the provinces from September to December, attacks which were broadly known to have resulted in targeting of civilians and civilian objects. He made this choice even after the massive civilian casualties and destruction of the charged 5 December attacks. He continued to make this choice during and after the terrible atrocities unfolding in Yaloke, Karno, and Berberati in early 2014, of which Mr. Deputy Prosecutor spoke this morning. He made this choice again after he had relocated to Bangui in February and was surrounded by the visible effects of the anti-Balaka's actions, including the destruction of property, destruction of mosques, and displacement of Muslims in Bangui. For the purpose of these confirmation proceedings, the prosecution relies on the following evidence to show that there are substantial grounds to believe that Mr. Mokom had the requisite intent and knowledge. I would like to start with the witness evidence, and for this request another private session, please.
The request is granted. Mr. Court Officer, kindly proceed.
We're back in open session, Mr. President.
Thank you. You may proceed.
P0884 stated at trial that all Central Africans were aware of the anti-Balaka combat operations in the provinces in 2013. He was aware of the attacks from the radio and by the print media. Everyone was informed, he says. I was not the only one to be aware of that. All Central Africans were aware. CAR OTP 00001097 at pages 40 to 41. And I recall Mr. Mokom saying this morning as well, related to the Seleka attacks, that all Central Africans were aware from the media. P2027 stated that he decided not to join the anti-Balaka and that it was foreseeable that things would end badly. I quote him. He says, God can be my witness that I foresaw everything that was happening. I saw the anti-Balaka actions and told some of them to respect humanitarian law because they will end up dead or in prison. I knew all along that things would end badly. CAR OTP 20780059, paragraphs 88 and 136. Another insider witness stated, I could foresee that the conflict would be bloody and violent. The anti-Balaka were already going too far prior to the December 5th. CAR OTP 21274238 at 4270, paragraph 177. Now, Your Honors, the inference that Mr. Mokom had the requisite knowledge that the crimes as charged would occur in the ordinary course of events is also supported by the fact that anti-Balaka crimes were wildly reported in the media, so much so that one could not escape it. On your screen, you have a selection of newspaper clippings of national and international publications. These all dealt with topics such as, for example, targeting of Muslim civilians in Bosangoa and other regions in the relevant time, describing the attacks not only as attacks against the Seleka, but precisely their impact on civilian lives and livelihoods. The ERNs that are here seen and displayed are CAR OTP 20611427, CAR OTP 20790622, CAR OTP 20740421, CAR OTP 20014118, CAR OTP 20820793, and CAR OTP 20791940. This is how Centrafrique Matin titled its first page on 4th December, reporting the 2nd December horror in Bouali, where 12 were killed by machete and also children seriously wounded. Mr. Deputy Prosecutor already referenced this incident this morning. The reference to this slide I would like to give quickly. 2088? 2648. Sorry for that. The reporting of crimes continued after the 5th December attacks. Again, the reporting was clear. It was not only about attacking Seleka or skirmishes between anti-Balaka and Seleka. It was about the crimes targeting Muslim civilians, illustrating the same pattern of criminality continuing throughout CAR. The references here are CAR OTP 20014429, CAR OTP 20014446, CAR OTP 20791147, 20014330, and 2079-1166. Furthermore, in this period, several UN Security Council resolutions recognized not only the armed conflict itself, but its impact, the impact of the violence against civilians. The violence in CAR remained at such a level of intensity throughout this period that the Security Council actually authorized foreign military intervention under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And the references here for these resolutions are at CAR OTP 2001-0256, 0275, CAR OTP 2051-0665, CAR OTP 2001 at 1043, and CAR OTP 2091 at 0488. When Mr. Mokom relocated to Bangui, he was in close proximity to the crimes as they were happening. Nonetheless, he met with the comm zones. He went to their bases. He continued to support the groups united under the national coordination now. To make the anti-Balaka stronger and more effective, yes. But he chose to proceed anyway, when a reasonable person would have walked away. This, Your Honors, contributed to a disastrous situation for Central African Muslims. His support for the group's actions left thousands of others to be expelled, enclaved under dire condition, have their property destroyed at the hands of the anti-Balaka elements while he was part of the national coordination. Mr. Mokom made his choice. And Your Honors, he should now be held responsible for the foreseeable consequences of that choice and stand trial. And with that, I end my submissions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, then, 325, we will continue now with the submissions on the merits of the common legal representative of victims. You may proceed.
Je vais enlever mon truc là. Bon. Monsieur, alors c'est ouvert. Monsieur le Président,
Mr.
Madame,
President,
Messieurs les juges,
Your Honors,
tout d'abord,
to begin with,
permettez-moi de
allow
saluer
me
les victimes
to salute the
de
victims
Bangui,
from the Central African Republic, Bangui, Bosangwak,
les victimes du Tchad,
Bosembele,
de Djamena,
Kagwa, as well as victims from Chad, Jamena, Bosangwa, Batempele, who travel
du Cameroun,
every time, and the victims from Congo, Cameroon, who have come from Africa, but also from France and from other parts of the world. Thanks to the social networks, these victims are there with us. They are listening to us, and we are there for them. We find ourselves here today
dans le cadre
before your court
de confirmation
within the framework of a confirmation of charges hearing.
du statut de
That is Article 61.7 of the Rome Statute. The purpose is the assessment of the charges
celle-ci, en effet,
made by the prosecutor, and these charges
de croire
should
que
have
M. Mokom
substantial grounds
les crimes
to believe that Mr. Mokom actually perpetrated the crimes charged against
atteignent
him.
le seuil
and that if these charges reach the sufficient threshold at this preliminary stage, then we will move on to trial. This preliminary decision is fundamental for the victims. They open the path for them to what is possible, to know more about what happened, to know about the events, and to try to understand. Your decision will define the demarcations of the elements, the temporal and geographical jurisdiction. The submissions at this time do not have as purpose to deal with the charges as elaborated by the prosecutor, but rather to consider them from the point of view of the victims. I will therefore look at these observations in two parts. One, on the stakes of the procedure for the participating victims, and the other part will relate to their expectations, which means what can this procedure bring to them and what is the meaning of their participation. Regarding the stakes, the first stake for the victims is to know the crimes charged and that may have been committed by the accused person. Which are the crimes? And this is essentially Articles 7 and 8 of the Rome Statute, and they were read out. And they include murder, rape, and the legal representatives of the victims welcome the fact that this count or charge has been integrated as a separate item on the list of crimes. Attacks against buildings dedicated to religion, destruction of property, pillaging, deportation, forcible transfer, severe deprivation of liberty, and persecution. This is important because to talk about the things that happened is to acknowledge that they actually existed. It is to roll back the attitudes of denial, refusal of reality. These facts are there. They exist. To talk about these things, to lay out these crimes in a judicial environment, particularly when it comes to the crime of rape. In any case, when we talk about this in a socio-cultural context, which is cohesive to the victims, this is something that is essential to talk about and to mention specifically. In reality, it appears that this is the main reason which is always there in the materials for the victims to participate. Now, even though the documents containing the charges mention only 2 victims of rapes, the reality is different. The descriptions given by victims, all of them mention that these acts were perpetrated under threat, forcibly, and in a cohesive environment. As Maître Duzima recalled this morning, it was a way of humiliating the victims to take possession of their bodies and to dominate the population through coercion. These are acts that constitute attacks against or outrages against personal dignity. Talking about these facts will roll back ignorance, and this is a good thing.
Le deuxième enjeu
Now, talking about the second stake, it is illustrated by the victims that we are representing,
à travers leur
who all
de la
are
nature
testifying through their accounts of the particularly cruel nature of the attacks that they were subjected to. They also talk about their widespread and systematic nature. It appears that all these people who were individual victims were targeted as a group of people, collectively targeted, and this group was the group of Muslims. For example, the attack of the town of Bangui, in which 130,000 Muslims lived, which was equal to 18% of the total population. The attacks of Bosangwa, because there were two attacks there, and Bosangwa was the headquarters of the Wuhan prefecture, in which there were 36,000 Muslim inhabitants, representing 20% of the population.
qui a été développé
In light of what was elaborated upon this morning,
Balaka
the anti-Balaka elements
au ciblage
were
systématique
systematically targeting the houses belonging to Muslims, which were pillaged and destroyed.
mentionne
The victims mention
intentionnelle
the intentional appropriation of property belonging to Muslims for personal use.
ces musulmans
In fact, these Muslims
leurs moyens d'existence
lost their means of subsistence,
de première nécessité,
which were made up of
leur maison, leur commerce,
commodities,
marchandises,
necessary commodities for daily use, and it also included
rester
their
sans
shops.
moyen de vie.
Now,
Le choix
how
était fuir,
can someone remain without having a means of living?
et j'en arrive
The choice was to flee
il ressort
and to go elsewhere.
aussi des victimes
Now, there is also murder. From the accounts of the victims, it emerges that the impact of murder was unspeakable. It destroys the family cell by the absence of mourning, by the fact that people do not know how everything happened, and by the impossibility of having a place to reflect and mourn. And this is very frightful when one is aware of the importance of the family unit in Africa, and when one knows that trauma is generational. By authorizing these victims to participate, you are reassuring them of their rights as acknowledged by the Rome Statute and enshrined in the Rome Statute for their benefit. You are honoring them and respecting them. And so they are acknowledging this fact solemnly in this opening day of the procedure against Mr. Mokom. This right must be effective,
communs
And it is up to us, the legal representatives, the common representatives of the victims, to find the mechanisms and modalities for their implementation.
que leur soit
Over these 3 days of hearings, they hope that they will be recognized in the roles that they deserve. The third stake
celui-ci.
is as
Ce
follows.
procès relève aussi d'un chemin de mémoire.
This trial is also a path of memory
Formidable
on the road of resilience, which is a formidable tool for knowledge, the
et l'énoncé
ascertainment of the truth through testimonies and the drafting of the charges, which include the locations, dates, names, and all the other information that the victims need to know. They also need to know how, where,
leur père,
and when
leurs enfants,
their husbands, fathers, and children
parode,
perished.
question
These are questions that trouble them
de réponse.
and questions for which they do not have answers.
C'est un formidable
This trial is a formidable tool of transmission
et leur
for surviving victims and their families.
donne à comprendre
All this makes them understand, reflect,
effroyable,
and to revisit their frightful memories, which are too heavy and too traumatic to be talked about and given verbal
communication
concretization because they have been buried for far too long. This trial, it is the only communication tool of transmission which can be heard to say the things that are unspeakable,
de leur vécu
to replace in their proper context through the discussions and submissions the memorial construction or the construction of the memory of what these people lived through, as well as the collective history of the car.
ce procès
And their rape is the illustration of
viendra pour elle
some of these things that are unspeakable. This trial, over time, for the victims will become a framework for reference and touchstones that are common and based on which they will construct their future. So these are the collective and individual perspectives. This is the stake of this trial for the survivors.
Nous ne pouvons pas nous reconstruire.
Regarding the
Pas mes
expectations,
mots.
we cannot reconstruct without justice. These are not my words. These are the words of a single victim, but it has the merit of representing the thoughts of so many others. We cannot rebuild our lives without justice. Mr. President, Your Honors, please remember these few words
Fasse écho tout au long
so
de
that
l'audience.
those words should be at the forefront of the proceedings throughout the hearings. This trial, over time, as I have already said, will become for the surviving victims a reference framework, a common reference framework to rebuild their lives and to give an account of the history to future generations. The acts took place in the past, but their lives are taking place today.
La deuxième attente.
It was in the camps and in the enclaves. So, which future will they have? Now, regarding the second expectation, it is to draw the lessons to the extent possible to break the chain of violence and hatred, as well as instability, that led thousands of victims to flee into exile and compelled thousands of others to live in deplorable conditions that are not dignified for the human being. The court has been looking at these crimes perpetrated in the car ever since 2003. It is necessary to put an end to this transgenerational trauma. It is necessary to anchor in people's minds, in the collective memory, these events that happened, but not for vengeance. Never again. It is necessary to educate people for respect, dignity for everyone, and the elimination of all forms of racial, ethnic, and religious discriminations. Teach people culture and peace, knowledge of the facts. The establishment of the historic truth will make it possible for the education and the respect for the rights of the young generations and orphans, those who are living in the camps and those who are exiled, to have their roots. We have to give them this education. It is a guarantee that it shall never happen again. It's to give them hope for another better life, hope that one can come out of problems using other means than war and violence. The third expectation is within this framework, the collective framework of the participation of the victims, and it is related generally and individually. Now, what is the meaning of this participation? These victims are very numerous. Now, already at the level of the participating victims that you have accepted, they are numerous. The others are not yet known. They want answers to their questions, to their sufferings. And those of us, the legal representatives of the victims, and they, the participating victims, we are going to work to be heard, and that the place and role of the victims to be reinforced in the records, in the international records. And to conclude, this place of the victims should be reinforced. To conclude, this Mokom trial for the victims are a means of opening up other possibilities, work for history, and give visibility to those who do not have voice. It is the fight of their lives so that tomorrow they should be able to rebuild their lives. This judicial response is expected by the victims. Mr. President, your honors, please do not disappoint them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, madam. You done your part, and your colleagues are supposed to continue speaking. Okay, so all right, then we can.
Mes collègues prendront la parole demain.
My colleagues will take the floor tomorrow, Mr. President.
Madam, we still have time. We've started late today, so we would have roughly 20 minutes. If you're prepared to start, then you comfortable with it?
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, what we have been listening to since this morning have affected what we have already disclosed, and for those reasons we would like to revise what we had presented, and that is why we would rather start tomorrow.
All right, I understand. Okay, I accept that. So we'll adjourn the hearing and for tomorrow at 9:30. And I would like to thank everyone, the participants, but especially our interpreters and everyone who's working behind the scenes from the registry, technical experts, and everyone for allowing the hearing to take place. Thank you very much, and see you tomorrow. Have a nice afternoon.
All right, we will be.